My name is Juliette Mitchell. I'm not a specialist. I'm what people call a polymath, which means I go across a lot of disciplines. I'm a professor of psychoanalysis and gender studies in the University of Cambridge, where I established a centre for gender studies. I'm also a professor in University College London, where I teach a graduate course on theoretical psychoanalysis. Welcome to my exp. Psychoanalysis is absolutely central to the feminist revolution. It doesn't mean that everybody has to study psychoanalysis. What is essential is that we live how we are as women. That's what's the concern of feminism. It's as women, but of course as men too. We live ourselves unconsciously at least as much as we live ourselves consciously. So what do I mean by unconsciously? Well, there are two ways in which I mean unconsciously. There are two types of unconscious, if you like. We live ourselves unconsciously in a way that is just we don't know about it. We forget about it. I would call that technically pre-conscious. It's just a way of thinking that's like conscious, but we're not yet aware of it. And then there's something much more important, which is the subject of psychoanalysis, which is a dynamic unconscious, and it's a different way of thinking. And the easiest way to think about it as an unconscious way of thinking is to think of dreams. All we're talking about is different ways of thinking. Conscious thinking is like what we're doing now. We're talking rationally, etc., we hope. But unconsciously, it's as though we were dreaming. And that's incredibly important because we do an awful lot of our time thinking unconsciously. And if you think about men and women, but I'm obviously interested in women here, what I'm talking about is the fact that women live as oppressed people as much as men oppress them in some senses. We all have to live how we are in an unconscious way as well as a conscious way. And that's why anything to do with psychoanalysis is so important. So even if one doesn't want to actually study it, which I don't think you have to, one has to be aware that it's there because psychoanalysis is the only method that we have so far of understanding unconscious forms of thinking. The way to use Freud as a feminist is quite simple in a sense. It's to say, look, we can take over and use this very, very complex and detailed analysis of patriarchy. We can make it our own by seeing what it is that it's describing. And in my first work on that, that's really what I was doing. I was looking at patriarchy and saying, don't let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's say, okay, here it is, an analysis of patriarchy. We are saying we are suffering from patriarchy, which we are. Let's use this analysis of patriarchy to produce a feminist understanding of patriarchy. The feminist understanding of patriarchy is that a girl does not have the same Oedipus complex as a boy. The boy's Oedipus complex is incest with the mother and terror that if they persist in incest with the mother, the father will castrate them. Now, the woman is described as already castrated, and that's Germaine Greer's female eunuch. Now, wait a minute, we're not female eunuchs. What are we if we're already castrated? What does that mean? What does castration mean? What is penis envy? What are these concepts that are used by Freud to define psychoanalysis, to define what actually happens in patriarchy? Let's look at it as a social situation, not one that's prescribed by biology, but as something that all cultures produce. Now, why do all cultures produce this? Well, first of all, every culture in the world regulates some excesses of sexuality. There's some sexuality that is beyond acceptance within any culture. And that has an umbrella title, which is incest. And what psychoanalysis is doing is saying, okay, all cultures have incest. Now, psychoanalysts are far too narrow in their definition of that and think that just what we mean by Western notion of incest is what incest is. Incest could be to not have intercourse in the bush, for example. Incest has a wide range of excesses of sexuality, but there's no culture that doesn't prescribe some excess sexuality, and incest is a useful term to use as a sort of cover term for it. All societies have some form of killing, which must be prohibited because it's excessive. That form of killing is known as murder. All societies prohibit murder. So what psychoanalysis is doing is saying, what is it that we're doing when we prohibit incest and we prohibit murder? And that applies only to men. The question about whether psychoanalysis falls short to address feminist questions is interesting insofar as if you think about women as 51% of the population, what they have in common is that we all have an unconscious. Nobody doesn't have an unconscious. So it has a huge part to play. And when I say a huge part of our lives are unconscious, a larger part than are conscious. So it has a huge part to play. But it doesn't have a part to play in what feminism might decide is the next best important political thing. If you're a Me Too person, for example, it's much more important to be aware that it wasn't that movies that you were making was the main object and that the sexual harassment and rape, etc., was a side issue. It was that the movies were a side issue and the central issue was the rape and sexual harassment. That's an immediately important. Now, you can use psychoanalysis there to understand things further if you want, or you can not use it. So it's both, if you want to use it, it speaks to a very big part of our lives, our unconscious lives. If you don't want to use it, it's because it's not where you're thinking about women is at that point at which you enter into the feminist struggle. So it's both as useful as you want to make it and something that you're very pleased other people are doing, I hope.